How does a rebellion with no navy, no gold, and an army that has not been paid in 8 months force the most powerful empire on earth to lay down its weapons? On an October morning in 1781, the answer is standing in a muddy field outside a small tobacco port called Yorktown, Virginia. Charles Cornwallis, general of His Majesty's forces, is trapped. Behind him is a river. In front of him is an army he cannot outrun and a fleet he cannot outsail. He has nowhere left to go. George Washington has been chasing a moment like this one for 6 years. 6 years of retreats. 6 years of an army that nearly dissolves every winter and has to be rebuilt every spring. This morning, he does not need to retreat. He needs Cornwallis to march his men out, stack their weapons, and admit defeat in front of the world. Everything the rebellion has bled for comes down to the next few hours. Will an empire that has never lost a war to one of its own colonies finally be forced to rewind 6 years to 1775? 13 British colonies along the Atlantic coast are angry about taxes they never voted for and laws they never wrote. Angry enough to start shooting at Lexington and Concord. What nobody in either army expects is that this brushfire will burn for 6 more years. The Continental Congress puts a Virginia planter named George Washington in charge of an army that barely deserves the name. Farmers, clerks, men who have never fired a musket at another human being. Britain, by contrast, fields the best-funded military machine on the planet, backed by the world's most powerful navy. On paper, this war is already over. It very nearly is. Washington loses New York in 1776. He loses Philadelphia in 1777. His army spends that winter at Valley Forge, freezing, starving, and shrinking by the week, while a Prussian volunteer named Friedrich Wilhelm von Steuben drills the survivors into something resembling a professional force, shouting orders in a mixture of German and French that most of his men understand roughly half of. An empire counts colonies. It does not always count patience. And patience, it turns out, is the one resource the rebellion has in surplus, because giving up was never actually on the table for men who had already been declared traitors. A hanging offense has a way of focusing the mind on winning. Then comes a battlefield reversal that changes everything. At Saratoga, New York, in the autumn of 1777, an entire British army under General John Burgoyne surrenders. It is the first time in this war that a British force this size has been forced to lay down its arms, and the news crosses the Atlantic to a very interested audience. In Paris, Benjamin Franklin has spent 2 years trying to convince the French crown that these colonies are worth betting on. Saratoga is his proof. France still remembers losing Canada to Britain in the 7 Years' War less than 2 decades earlier. And revenge, it turns out, negotiates faster than idealism ever could. France signs a formal alliance with the United States in 1778. Spain and the Dutch Republic edge in behind them. What began as 13 colonies against an empire is now quietly a global war. The next 3 years, the fighting shifts south. Britain's strategy is simple. If the northern colonies will not be pacified, perhaps the southern ones, with their large loyalist populations, will be easier to hold. Cornwallis wins battles in the Carolinas, at Camden and Guilford Courthouse, but he keeps winning them at a cost he cannot afford to keep paying. After Guilford Courthouse, a British member of Parliament named Charles James Fox is said to have remarked that another victory like it would ruin the entire army, which is a fairly polite way of describing a general who keeps technically winning himself into a corner. A general who bleeds his army dry to hold ground he cannot actually govern is not really winning. He's just losing more slowly than everyone around him. Meanwhile, a Continental general named Nathanael Greene perfects a strategy of never quite letting his own smaller force be destroyed, retreating, regrouping, and forcing Cornwallis to chase him across hundreds of miles of Carolina backcountry for nothing more than the privilege of exhausting his own supply lines. By the summer of 1781, Cornwallis marches his exhausted force into Virginia and makes a decision that will define the rest of his career. He digs in at Yorktown, a small port on a narrow peninsula, expecting the Royal Navy to keep his men supplied and, if needed, evacuate them by sea. It is a reasonable plan. For over a century, British control of the Atlantic has been close to absolute. Why would this moment be any different? Because for the first time in the entire war, that control is not absolute at all. A French fleet under the Comte de Grasse, 28 ships strong, is sailing north from the Caribbean toward the Chesapeake Bay at exactly the moment Cornwallis needs the sea lane open. Washington, watching from New York, sees the opportunity forming before almost anyone else does. He abandons his long-standing plan to attack the British garrison in New York City and instead marches south. Alongside the French General Comte de Rochambeau and roughly 5,000 French troops, covering over 400 miles in barely a month. It is one of the great gambles of the war, and it depends entirely on a French fleet arriving on schedule and winning a battle Washington cannot fight himself. De Grasse gets there first. In early September 1781, his fleet meets a British squadron under Admiral Thomas Graves just outside the Chesapeake. The Battle of the Chesapeake is not the largest naval engagement of the century, and it does not sink many ships. It does something more decisive than that. It drives the British fleet back to New York for repairs, and it seals the bay behind them. Cornwallis's escape route by sea is gone. His resupply line is gone. What is left is a siege, and sieges only end one way when the trapped side cannot be relieved. Through late September and into October, the combined American and French forces dig their trenches closer and closer to the British lines, a slow, grinding process that looks less like the cinematic charges people imagine and more like methodical engineering under fire. On the night of October 14th, Continental troops led by a young colonel named Alexander Hamilton storm a British defensive position known as Redoubt 10 in a fast, bayonet-only assault, ordered to keep their muskets unloaded so that no accidental shot would give away the attack. It works. The redoubt falls in under 30 minutes, and with it goes the last real obstacle protecting Cornwallis's position. By October 17th, Cornwallis knows the math. His men are exhausted, his position is unworkable, and no rescue fleet is coming in time to matter. He requests terms. 2 days later, on October 19, 1781, the British Army marches out of Yorktown to formally surrender. Cornwallis himself does not appear, citing illness, a diagnosis that historians have treated with polite skepticism ever since. In his place, his second-in-command, Brigadier General Charles O'Hara, hands over his sword. According to multiple accounts from soldiers present that day, the British band plays a tune called "The World Turned Upside Down" as they march between rows of the very army they were sent to crush. Whether the song was actually played, or whether it simply became too good a detail for the story to let go of, remains genuinely disputed. Either way, it is hard to imagine a more fitting soundtrack. Here is the twist most people never learn in school. Yorktown is remembered as an American triumph, and it was, but it was not primarily an American victory in the way the story usually gets told. Siege involved roughly the same number of French troops on the ground as American ones. The naval blockade that made the entire trap possible was fought and won by the French Navy alone, with no American ships involved at all. Without Rochambeau's army marching alongside Washington's, and without de Grasse's fleet sealing the bay at exactly the right week, Cornwallis simply sails away, resupplies, and the war grinds on for who knows how many more bloody years. Independence, in the moment it was actually secured, was never a solo performance. It was a coalition holding its breath together at the right river mouth on the right afternoon. News of the surrender reaches London in late November, and it does what 6 years of costly, inconclusive fighting could not. It breaks the political will to continue. Prime Minister Lord North, hearing the report, is said to have responded as though he had been shot, repeating, "Oh God, it is all over," again and again. Parliament, already exhausted by the expense of fighting France, Spain, and the Dutch Republic on top of the colonies, votes within months to end offensive operations in America. Formal negotiations begin, and the Treaty of Paris is signed in 1783, in which Britain recognizes the United States as a free and independent nation. Fighting did not stop the instant Cornwallis's sword changed hands. But the outcome, from that morning at Yorktown onward, was never seriously in doubt again. The legacy of that muddy field runs further than most people realize. It is worth pausing on how close the whole plan came to falling apart before it started. Washington's march south depended on Rochambeau agreeing to abandon a siege of New York the two generals had spent months preparing. On de Grasse choosing to sail for the Chesapeake instead of returning straight to the Caribbean as his orders technically instructed, and on a British fleet under Graves arriving just late enough to lose the one battle that mattered most. Any one of those decisions breaking the other way, and Cornwallis marches out of Yorktown a free man instead of a prisoner. Yorktown did not just end a war. It set the template for how the young United States would think about the rest of the world for generations afterward, alternating between founding-era gratitude toward the Allies who had made independence possible and a deep, stubborn instinct toward isolation, as though the nation could not quite decide whether it owed the world a debt or owed it nothing at all. Washington himself, watching a French fleet do what no American ship could have done, walked away from Yorktown having learned a lesson many later American leaders would spend the next 2 centuries relearning the hard way, that even the most determined cause in the world can still need a friend with a bigger navy. The borders drawn afterward, the government built on the promise that legitimacy runs from the people rather than a crown, the very existence of the country arguing about its own history right now. All of it traces back to a general who ran out of river to retreat across. So the question was never really whether a rebellion with no navy, no gold, and an unpaid army could beat an empire outright. It couldn't, not alone, and it never had to. It only had to survive long enough and choose its allies well enough for the empire to run out of river first.